Hey everybody, it's Courtney and welcome back. Today I am going to be doing some very simple watercoloring. I'll be using the Crokisses stamp set by Create a Smile, and I also have this palette. It's Daniel Smith watercolors. You can get these palettes from Simon Says Stamp, and it just gives you basically a sample of a variety of different colors of the Daniel Smith watercolors without having to buy the whole tube. I'm not only cheap, but I'm kind of broke, so I can't afford the real thing, so I usually stick to the samples, and you get enough in here to do several different cards, so it's definitely worth the money. Here I brought out my Misty, and I'm stamping on Canson watercolor paper, and I'll be using antique linen distress ink. I'm just kind of playing around with my positioning here. I know I wanted to keep my images off there to the left. And I'll stamp these twice just to make it easier for you guys to see. Typically, I only stamp them once, just so that it's easier for those lines to kind of disappear as you watercolor. Once I had my first two stamped out, I laid out a piece of, this is Eclipse masking paper, and I'm just going to be stamping those same images and just masking out the right side of them. I didn't even bother to cut the whole mask. And I will position this third little flower here and again stamp that twice with the antique linen. Now this is the only images we're going to have on the card other than the sentiment later. So I went ahead and removed my mask, and we will move on to the watercoloring. Now I want to let you guys know I am far from an expert on watercoloring. I keep it real simple, so I'm going to show you the two different techniques that I use. So for this bottom flower, I am starting off by using clean water and covering up the entire petal. My paintbrush here is not soaking wet, but it's pretty damp. You can always add more water if it doesn't seem to be blending, but you can't, it's harder to take away without taking up the color. So I just drop in a little bit of the color, mainly on the base of the petal, and this is the Rose of Ultramarine. It's a purple, obviously. And I'm just letting the water kind of spread that color out. Sometimes you have to play around with it, add a little bit more water, kind of drag some of that color out to the edges of the petal. Let it sit for a minute or two because it will change, it will continue to blend. To add a little bit of a different shade of purple, I'm also going in with the quinacridone violet. That word is hard, so I'm not sure if I'm saying that right either. But I'm just basically putting that on the tips, or the base of the petals, and kind of letting that spread with the other purple as well as the water. I'm making sure that I'm not working on two petals that are directly next to one another. Being these petals are wet, they will blend. So make sure that whatever petal you are working on, both petals on either side are dry. This next large flower, I am not dampening the cardstock or the watercolor paper first. I'm just going in with a damp paintbrush and the paint and putting my darkest areas down. I'll clean off my brush, dab off most of the water, and cover up the entire petal and kind of work my way towards that line of color that we put down, and that will gradually spread out. Remember, you can always add more. So if it's not spreading enough, or you want to add a little bit more, like here I went in with that quinacridone violet and added a little bit where the darkest areas of that petal will be, which will basically be where it touches that other petal and where it's kind of folded over on itself. I moved back to this bottom petal this bottom flower while I let that top petal dry, mainly because I just wanted to see how it was going to dry before I did the rest of my petals, see if I wanted to add anything additional or maybe possibly leave something out. Now, if you make a mistake, if you put too much color down, or maybe you go in with a petal that next to another petal that's not quite dry and starts blending, just dampen the area with clean water, take a paper towel and just dab it. Don't rub it, or else you're going to rub the pigment around. Just dab it up and it will take up most of the pigment. You'll obviously have to add more. but it will clean up any errors or mistakes that you make. Now you'll see me go back and forth, not only between flowers, but you'll see me go back to some of the petals that may appear finished, just to kind of clean up some of the edges. Maybe I didn't go all the way to the edge with my water, and it's just not, you can still see that line of the antique linen ink. You may see it on the lighter areas anyway. It's not going to completely disappear. If you only stamped it once, you'd have a better shot at it disappearing completely. But being we did stamp it twice, you're still going to see a very faint outline of the image when we're done here. So you can see I Googled a picture of these crocuses, and they're mostly purples and yellows. And some of them have lines within the petals. And you can see on the bottom image there, some of those lines are built right into the stamp. I'm going to add my lines in after I'm done with my watercoloring and after it's completely dry. If I did this card again, I'd skip that step just because I think it didn't match the other flowers as well. So I definitely would skip that, but oh well, I did what I did. So for this petal, I'm going around the little stamen here, and I'm just leaving the stamen white for now. We'll fill those in later, and I'm not doing any kind of shading on those at all. But behind that stamen, it would be darker. So I'm adding more pigment behind it, and I'm not really dragging it out too much. So I want that color to be dark behind those stamen. It would cast a shadow. Now, as I'm moving back and forth, we will also be watercoloring this other flower, which I'm going to do yellow, kind of like a golden yellow. This is quinacridone gold. And this actually blended really nicely. I was worried because sometimes, I know from my Copics, which is what I'm used to, it's sometimes hard to blend yellows. You usually have to bring in an orange or bring in a brown in order to get that shading. This actually worked out really well. I didn't have to bring in anything else. I didn't want to because I knew the stamen was going to be yellow. So I didn't want that to clash with the rest of the flower. For these bottom petals here, there's really not going to be much of a shadow here because they're not underneath anything else. So I'm just concentrating my darkest areas on the very base of the petal and kind of working that color up and fading out to a very light purple. And I'll do the same thing on this little yellow flower as well. I'm not worrying about shading on the middle flower where it's kind of laying underneath the larger flower. Like I said, I'm a beginner at the watercolor, and I know that you guys had requested it in a previous video, so I'm just kind of showing you what works for me. There's a lot more detailed tutorials out there on YouTube from much better watercolorists than myself, but I am practicing and I'm hoping to get better. So here I'm just going back in and adding a little bit of additional color here and there where I felt like maybe it was too pale or maybe where I had too much pigment. I wanted to take some of that up and kind of redo a petal. You can basically redo the whole thing by taking your paper towel and just dabbing that up. Now you'll see that only one of these flowers actually has a stem as part of the stamped image. There is a stem with a couple of leaves in the stamp set, and I was initially going to go ahead and stamp that, but I decided that it's just going to be a straight line, so I'm pretty sure that I can just do that freehand, being we don't have an outline of these images anyway. So for this bottom one here that has the stem built in, I'm going to be just adding some sap green and undersea green just to add a little bit of differentiation there. For these other flowers, I'm taking my clean paintbrush with clean water, going straight down and just leaving a trail of water there, and then dropping in my color and letting it spread, making a little bit thicker underneath where the flower and the stem meet. And I'm just letting that color blend. I went ahead and put my panel aside to air dry. I prefer to air dry my watercolors, whether it be regular watercolor or distress inks or oxides. Once that was dry, I did trim off 1/4 of an inch from the top and the bottom, or I'm sorry, the top and the side. And I'm going to bring out my Misty again here just because I know I'll have to double stamp that sentiment. And I'm going to be using a Hero Arts ink that somewhat matched the color of the purple flowers. And I did end up stamping that twice. I used my Tombow Mono multi-glue to adhere this to an A2 size card base, and this is kind of like a golden yellow. I wanted to bring out some of that yellow in that middle flower there. And once I adhered that, I realized that there was a little smudge on the bottom. I don't know what the smudge was from. It's not adhesive, and I didn't use any black or gray ink, so I'm not sure where it came from, but I just took my Tombow sand eraser and it came right up. Last, I took some Nuvo Jewel drops and just added a few drops around the sentiment and left this one super clean and super simple. And that is the card for today. Thanks a lot for stopping by, guys, and I hope you have a wonderful day.